If I sing well, will you give me a meal? The question hung in the air like a challenge, spoken by a 9-year-old girl who stood in the harsh fluorescent light of a backstage hallway at the largest television studio in Los Angeles. Her small hands gripped a guitar so broken, so battered, that it looked more like trash than an instrument. The strings hung loose, some missing entirely, and the wood bore scratches and stains from years of neglect. But Kesha Williams held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. The man standing before her, Richard Brennan, executive producer of Stars of America, wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with cufflinks that caught the light as he crossed his arms. He looked down at the girl, taking in her torn jeans, her faded t-shirt with holes at the seams, her bare feet, black with dirt from the streets, and then he laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or an uncomfortable sound. It was cruel. It echoed down that sterile hallway, bouncing off the concrete walls, carrying with it every ounce of contempt this man felt for the child standing before him. "Girl," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "do you really think you're here to win anything? You're here to make the audience laugh." Kesha didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. She'd lived worse. At 9 years old, she had already developed the kind of armor most people don't build until they're well into adulthood, if they ever build it at all. She adjusted the loose strings of her guitar, her fingers moving with surprising precision, and took a deep breath. Something whispered inside her at that moment, something that told her this would be different. This would be the last time she'd let anyone treat her like she was nothing. "I understand perfectly, sir," she replied, her voice calm, steady, almost unnervingly mature for someone so young. Richard frowned. There was something in her tone that unsettled him. This wasn't the response he'd expected. Dirty, barefoot children from the streets were supposed to be grateful, timid, eager to please. They weren't supposed to look at you with eyes that saw right through your expensive suit and your manufactured confidence. They weren't supposed to make you feel uncomfortable in your own building. 2 hours earlier, Kesha had been sleeping under a blue plastic awning 3 blocks from the studio. It wasn't much shelter, but it kept the morning dew off her face and gave her a small corner of the world to call her own. She'd learned to sleep light, one ear always open for danger, one hand always on her backpack. The streets of Los Angeles weren't kind to 9-year-old girls, especially not black girls with no family and no home. The sound of voices had pulled her from sleep. Loud, excited voices speaking in that particular tone people use when they're working on something they think is important. She'd opened her eyes to find 3 production assistants standing over her, clipboards in hand, expensive cameras slung over their shoulders. "Oh my God, she's perfect," one of them had said, a young woman with blonde highlights and designer sunglasses perched on her head. "Look at her. This is exactly what Richard wanted." They'd found her singing for coins near the subway entrance the day before. Her voice had stopped them in their tracks, clear, powerful, carrying a depth that seemed impossible from someone so small. But it wasn't her talent that excited them. It was the image, the contrast, the story they could sell. A dirty street kid with a broken guitar. Comic relief. Entertainment at someone else's expense. They'd offered her $20 and a hot meal if she'd come to the studio. Kesha, who hadn't eaten anything but a half-eaten sandwich she'd found in a trash can the day before, had said yes. She knew what they wanted. She'd seen enough of the world to understand exactly what role they expected her to play. But she'd said yes anyway, because Kesha Williams had a plan. "We'll put you at the end," Richard said now, consulting his clipboard with an air of bored efficiency. "After all the talented kids have performed, you come on to balance things out. Keep the energy light, entertaining." The way he said entertaining made it clear what he meant. She was there to fail, to stumble, to give the audience someone to feel superior to, someone to laugh at, while they celebrated the real talent, the kids with private music teachers and conservatory training and parents who could afford to nurture their gifts. What Richard Brennan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Kesha had grown up watching people like him, learning from them, memorizing every detail of how the world worked, how power operated, how cruelty disguised itself as entertainment. She knew exactly why she was there. She knew what role they expected her to play, but she also knew something they would never discover until it was far too late. In the 3 years, since losing her grandmother Dorothy, the only person who had ever truly believed in her, Kesha, had developed something no child should have to develop. The ability to see through the masks adults wore, the ability to recognize contempt hiding behind smiles, to sense danger wrapped in false kindness, to understand that sometimes the people who claimed to be helping you were actually setting you up to fall. And at that moment, as she watched Richard's fake smile and condescending looks, as she felt the weight of his judgment pressing down on her like a physical force, she made a decision that would change everything. "Can I ask you a question, sir?" she said, tilting her head slightly, with what looked like innocent curiosity. Richard sighed, glancing at his watch. "Make it quick, kid. We have a show to record. Do you have children?" The question caught him off guard. His eyebrows rose slightly, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed persona cracked. "I do," he said slowly. "2 girls." "Why?" Kesha smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but something in it made Richard's heart beat just a little faster without him understanding exactly why. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't. The smile of someone who was 3 steps ahead while you were still figuring out the game. "Just curious," she replied softly. She filed that information away along with everything else she'd observed in the past 2 hours. The way Richard treated his assistants barking orders, never saying please or thank you. The way he laughed louder when other producers were around, performing his cruelty for an audience. The way his eyes went cold when he looked at her, like she wasn't quite human, like she was a prop instead of a person. She remembered all of it as she walked toward the stage area, still holding her broken guitar like a treasure. Kesha thought about the letter hidden in her torn backpack, the letter her grandmother had left her with specific, careful instructions. "Only open when you are ready to use everything I taught you." My granddaughter. 3 years on the streets had been enough. She was ready. The letter explained who she really was. It revealed connections that would make everyone in this building swallow every cruel word they'd spoken. It contained truth that could turn humiliation into triumph, contempt into consequence. But more than that, it reminded her of Dorothy's most important lesson. When the world tries to diminish you, you grow twice as big. When they try to silence you, you sing 3 times as loud. If you're watching this unfold, and you're thinking about what Kesha must be feeling right now, this 9-year-old girl holding a broken guitar, knowing she's being set up to fail before we go deeper into this case, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Backstage at Stars of America, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. While Kesha sat alone on the cold concrete floor of a hallway, the other participating children were being treated like royalty. Production assistants ran back and forth with trays of gourmet snacks, fresh fruit, artisan sandwiches, bottled water with designer labels. Professional makeup artists fussed over the children's appearances, touching up foundation, adjusting hair, making sure every detail was camera perfect. "Attention, everyone." Richard Brennan's voice boomed across the backstage area as he clapped his hands together. "Remember, you are the future of American music. Today, the whole country will get to know your talents. You're representing the best this nation has to offer." The children beamed, their parents standing proudly beside them. This was their moment, their chance to shine on national television, to show the world what years of expensive training and privileged opportunities could create. Meanwhile, Kesha remained in her corner, still clutching her broken guitar. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since the small meal they'd given her that morning, and that had been hours ago. She watched a production assistant arrange an elaborate spread of snacks on a table near the talented children. Fresh croissants, chocolate-covered strawberries, small sandwiches cut into perfect triangles. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, and walked toward the present table. Maybe they'd forgotten about her. Maybe she could just take something small, something they wouldn't miss. But before she could reach the table, a hand gently pushed her back. Not violently, but firmly, unmistakably. "Sorry, sweetie," said the production assistant, a woman in her 30s, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But these snacks are only for the official participants. You must have come to accompany someone, right? Kesha looked up at her. Actually, I'm also going to perform. The assistant frowned, consulting the clipboard in her other hand. Her eyes scanned the list, and then something like recognition crossed her face. Oh, yes. You're the special girl. The way she said special made it abundantly clear that it wasn't a compliment. It was code. It meant different. It meant less than. It meant you don't really belong here. Well, anyway, the assistant continued, her voice taking on that particular tone adults use when they're trying to sound kind while being anything but. You'll be performing last. Very last. Richard Brennan gathered the group of talented children around him, his demeanor completely different from how he'd treated Kesha. He knelt down to their level, his smile warm and encouraging, his voice full of genuine enthusiasm. Now, listen carefully, he said, making eye contact with each child. You are going to represent the best this country has to offer. You've trained for this. You've worked hard. Today is your day to shine. Sing with your hearts, show off your perfect techniques, and make your families proud. The children nodded eagerly, their faces glowing with excitement and nervous energy. This was what they'd prepared for months, sometimes years of voice lessons and performance coaching, all leading to this moment. It was then that one of the participating children noticed Kesha sitting alone. The girl was named Ashley, 12 years old, blonde hair styled in perfect waves, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people spent on rent. She tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad," Ashley said, her voice carrying that particular tone of confused superiority. "Why is that girl here?" Her father, a man in an expensive business suit with slicked back hair and a Rolex on his wrist, glanced over at Kesha. He lowered his voice, but not quite enough. "Don't worry about it, princess," he replied, his tone dismissive. "She's here to. How can I explain it? To show the contrast, so that you can shine even brighter." Kesha heard every single word. Her hearing had become sharp from years of survival on the streets, where being able to pick up whispered conversations could mean the difference between safety and danger. She heard it all, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pure, controlled anger, not the hot, explosive kind that makes you lash out, not the kind that makes you cry or scream or break down. This was cold, focused, the kind of anger that sharpens your mind instead of clouding it, the kind that makes you more dangerous because it makes you more deliberate. Her mind flashed back 3 years, to a small apartment in Harlem that had smelled like vanilla candles and old books, to a woman with silver hair and hands weathered by decades of hard work, but still gentle when they brushed across piano keys or braided Kesha's hair. Dorothy Williams, her grandmother, the only person who had ever truly seen her, truly believed in her, truly loved her, without condition or reservation. Dorothy had been a gospel singer in a small church for over 40 years. Her voice had never made her rich or famous, but it had moved people. It had brought them to tears, to their knees, to moments of genuine transcendence, and she had taught Kesha everything she knew. "Kesha, my granddaughter," Dorothy used to say, her voice warm as honey, strong as steel. "When the world tries to diminish you, you grow twice as big, and when they try to silence you, you sing 3 times as loud." Dorothy had taught her more than just singing. She'd taught her music theory, composition, harmony, technique, things that children at fancy conservatories spent thousands of dollars to learn. Every evening after Dorothy came home from her job cleaning office buildings, she would sit with Kesha at their second-hand keyboard and teach. "Music is our secret weapon, child," Dorothy had told her more times than Kesha could count. "They can take our homes, our money, our dignity. They can try to break us in 1,000 different ways, but they can never take away what God has put in our voices. That belongs to us alone." After Dorothy died, cancer that spread too fast, because they couldn't afford proper treatment, because the insurance was too expensive, because the system had failed them like it failed so many. Kesha had ended up on the streets. There were no other relatives, no safety net, just a 9-year-old girl, and the memories of everything her grandmother had taught her. But she'd carried something with her that none of these television producers could have imagined. Years of rigorous vocal training, a deep, instinctive understanding of music that would make conservatory teachers weep with envy, and a grandmother's voice in her head, reminding her that she was worth more than the world wanted her to believe. "Hey girl." Richard's voice cut through her memories, sharp and dismissive. "Do you even know any songs? Because it would be a shame to waste TV time." Kesha looked up at him, her face calm, unreadable. "I know a few." Richard laughed, and several of the other producers joined in. It was the kind of laughter that comes easy when you're part of the powerful group, when you know you're safe to be cruel because no one will stop you. "A few," Richard repeated, as if it was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "What kind of a few? Street music? Rap? Something you learned begging for change?" The other children laughed too. Ashley covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes danced with amusement. The other kids nudged each other, sharing looks that said, "Can you believe this girl?" But Kesha just smiled. That same small, mysterious smile that seemed to know something everyone else didn't. "Can I ask you a question, Mr. Richard?" she said, her voice soft, almost innocent. Richard sighed, but gestured for her to continue. "Go ahead. Did you study music?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course I did," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "I have an MBA in entertainment management from UCLA. "How interesting," Kesha replied, her tone giving nothing away. She was filing this information away, adding it to everything else she'd observed. An MBA in entertainment management, not a music degree, not performance training, business school. "And do you play any instruments?" she asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't need to play to recognize talent when I see it," he retorted, irritation creeping into his voice. "I understand perfectly," Kesha said again, those same words she'd used before. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that hidden in Kesha's torn backpack, underneath the few spare clothes and the empty water bottle and the small notebook where she sometimes wrote down her thoughts, was a letter. A letter in a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax, written in Dorothy Williams' careful handwriting. A letter that explained not only who Kesha really was, but also revealed connections that would transform this program from a planned humiliation into something completely different, something Richard Brennan would regret for the rest of his life. As Richard walked away, still chuckling with the other producers about how entertaining it was going to be to watch this street kid try to sing, Kesha closed her eyes. She whispered so softly that no one could hear her, the words meant only for the grandmother who was no longer there to hear them. "Thank you, Grandma. The time has come to use everything you taught me." Each new humiliation, each dismissive look, each cruel laugh, each reminder that they saw her as less than human only strengthened something inside her. Something her oppressors couldn't see, a silent strength, fueled by years of survival, sharpened by genuine talent, and guided by the memory of a woman who had believed that a poor black girl from Harlem could be anything she wanted to be. What these privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat. Every cruel word was sealing their fate, and behind those seemingly vulnerable eyes, a perfect plan was beginning to take shape. While Richard and his team enjoyed planning her public humiliation, Kesha calmly walked to a quiet corner backstage, away from the noise and the laughter and the casual cruelty. She opened her torn backpack with careful hands and removed the yellowed envelope she'd been carrying for 3 years, the letter from Dorothy. Her grandmother's handwriting covered the front of the envelope in elegant script. "To my Kesha, only open when you are ready to use everything I taught you. 3 years of sleeping under awnings and in subway stations. 3 years of singing for coins and eating from trash cans. 3 years of being looked through, talked down to, dismissed as nothing. It had been enough." Kesha was ready. She carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was delicate, aged, but the words were still clear. What she read would have made anyone in that studio swallow every single word of contempt they'd spoken. Dorothy Williams hadn't been just an ordinary gospel singer. She'd been one of the first black women to graduate with a degree in music composition from the Juilliard School in 1965, a time when that was nearly impossible for someone who looked like her. The letter included photocopies of her diploma, of newspaper clippings celebrating her achievement, of letters from famous musicians who had studied under her or sought her guidance. But more importantly, The letter revealed a connection that would change everything. James Mitchell has always been like a son to me, Dorothy had written. When he was just a young black man trying to survive in the entertainment industry. When doors were being slammed in his face because of the color of his skin. I mentored him. I taught him that music had no color, no class, no barriers except the ones we allow others to build around us. He is now the CEO of the television network that produces Stars of America. If you ever need help, go to him. But remember, my darling granddaughter, don't ask for charity. Show him what you're capable of first. Prove that the training I gave you wasn't wasted. Let your talent speak before your circumstances do. Kesha carefully folded the 20 letter and placed it back in her backpack. Even after death, her grandmother was still teaching her, still guiding her, still showing her the way forward. Hey you, street girl. Ashley's voice cut through Kesha's thoughts. The blonde girl was approaching with a small group of other contestants, all of them looking at Kesha like she was some kind of curiosity, an exotic animal they'd discovered in their carefully curated world. My dad is curious to know how you got in here, Ashley said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Did you lie on your application? Kesha looked up at her, keeping her face calm and neutral. I didn't lie about anything. Oh, sure, Ashley replied, rolling her eyes dramatically. So you really think you stand a chance against us? I've been studying at the Manhattan Conservatory for 6 years. 6 years. I have private teachers who cost more per hour than you probably see in a month. The other children laughed, but Kesha remained silent. She continued tuning her broken guitar, her fingers moving across the strings with a precision that would have impressed any professional musician, testing each note, listening carefully, making micro-adjustments. Do you even know how to read music? Another girl taunted, a redhead named Jessica who'd been bragging earlier about her upcoming audition at Carnegie Hall. I know a few things, Kesha replied softly. And for the first time, she allowed a small smile to appear on her lips. What these privileged children didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Kesha's training had gone far beyond what their expensive conservatories could teach. In addition to everything Dorothy had taught her in those evening sessions in their small Harlem apartment, Kesha had spent the last 3 years practicing in places they'd never experienced, subway stations with acoustics so perfect they could make or break a voice. She'd learned to project without amplification, to fill enormous spaces with sound using nothing but her own vocal cords and perfect technique, urban tunnels where she discovered how to make a broken guitar sound like a Stradivarius, using finger positioning and pressure and vibrato to compensate for the instrument's imperfections, noisy street corners, where she'd developed the ability to maintain perfect rhythm and pitch even under extreme pressure, even with sirens wailing and people shouting and cars honking and wind whipping past. Every cold night had been training. Every hungry day had sharpened her focus. Every look of contempt on the streets had taught her to perform through discomfort, through judgment, through circumstances that would make most people give up. It was at that moment that Kesha noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. An older man was watching from the other side of the stage area. He wasn't dressed like the production crew. His clothes were too elegant, too refined. Gray hair, gold-rimmed, glasses, posture that spoke of authority but also warmth. And he was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the crowded backstage area, and something passed between them. Recognition, not of each other, but of something deeper. He saw something in her that the others had missed. The man began walking toward her, completely ignoring Ashley and the other contestants. They stepped aside automatically, sensing that this person commanded a different kind of respect than the production assistants and even Richard Brennan. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an authority that made everyone nearby fall silent. He addressed only Kesha. "May I ask your full name?" Kesha stood up slowly, still holding her guitar. She looked at this man who had somehow seen through all the assumptions and judgments that surrounded her like a fog. And she answered with careful deliberation. "Kesha Dorothy Williams." She emphasized her middle name. Dorothy. Her grandmother's name, given to her at birth, carried like a torch through her entire life. The man stood completely motionless. His face went through a series of emotions so quickly that most people wouldn't have caught them: shock, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked like grief mixed with joy. his eyes filled with tears that he tried to hide by adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "Dorothy Williams," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was my grandmother," Kesha said simply. James Mitchell felt as if someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. Dorothy Williams, the woman who had saved his life, who had believed in him when no one else would, who had taught him that his dreams weren't impossible, just difficult. She had died 3 years ago, and he hadn't even known she had a granddaughter. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. Where had this child been all this time? "Where have you been all these years?" he asked, his voice breaking despite his attempt to maintain composure. "On the streets," Kesha replied, her tone matter-of-fact, without self-pity or drama. "Ever since she died." James closed his eyes. The weight of that statement crushed him. While he'd been living in comfort, running a television empire, enjoying success that Dorothy had helped make possible, her granddaughter had been sleeping on the streets of Los Angeles. The injustice of it made him feel physically sick. "Do you sing like her?" he managed to ask. "She taught me everything I know." "And you came here too?" Kesha glanced toward the stage where Richard was still laughing with other producers, probably telling someone else about the hilarious prank they were going to play on the little street girl. "To show what I'm capable of," she said simply. James understood immediately. Dorothy had always taught that the best response to prejudice was excellence that couldn't be denied. She'd lived that philosophy herself, breaking through barriers that were supposed to be unbreakable, succeeding where everyone said she would fail. "Can I do you a favor?" he asked quietly, discreetly, aware that others might be watching. "Actually," Kesha said, and for the first time, James saw the shadow of Dorothy's not smile on this child's face. "Can I ask you a favor?" "Anything. Don't interfere. Let them do exactly what they're planning to do to me." James frowned, confused and troubled. "But they're going to try to humiliate you publicly. I heard Richard talking about the sound sabotage. About..." "No," Kesha interrupted gently. "And when they try, I want you to record everything. Every second. Every reaction. Every word they say." The smile that appeared on Kesha's face at that moment was identical to the one Dorothy used to give when she was about to teach someone an unforgettable lesson. It was a smile that said, "I'm 3 steps ahead of you, and you don't even know the game has started. They think they know who I am," Kesha continued, her voice soft but carrying a strength that reminded James so powerfully of Dorothy that he had to blink back tears. "But they know nothing about what I carry inside me. They don't know about the years of training. They don't know about the music that runs through my veins. They don't know about the strength my grandmother passed on to me." James nodded slowly, beginning to understand the plan. "And then you do what you think is right with that recording." At that exact moment, Richard reappeared, interrupting their conversation without even noticing who Kesha was talking to. His focus was entirely on the clipboard in his hand, on his schedule, on his carefully planned show that was supposed to end with the humiliation of a vulnerable child for ratings. "Hey girl," Richard said dismissively. "It's your time to shine. We hope you entertain us well out there." Kesha stood up, adjusting the broken guitar on her back. She walked toward the stage entrance with her head held high, her bare feet making no sound on the cold concrete floor. But before she was out of earshot, she turned back to James and whispered words that Dorothy had said to him decades ago. Words that had changed his life. "My grandmother always said that God gives us talents not only to elevate ourselves, but to elevate others who will come after us. Today is not just about me." James watched her walk away. This 9-year-old girl carrying a broken guitar and more dignity than most adults manage in a lifetime. For a moment, it was as if Dorothy were there again, walking onto a stage where people had bet she would fail, ready to prove that talent and determination could overcome prejudice and cruelty. While Richard organized the cameras to capture what he believed would be cruel entertainment at the expense of a vulnerable child, James quietly instructed his own film crew, people who answered directly to him, not to Richard, to record absolutely everything. Every word, every reaction, every second of what was about to happen, because something told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary humiliation. This was going to be the moment when a little girl from the streets would teach an entire nation that true talent doesn't choose its cradle, its color, or its social class. And that underestimating someone like Kesha Dorothy Williams was always a mistake that came with a price. The stage lights came on with an intensity that could blind someone unprepared for them. 500 people filled the studio audience, a sea of faces waiting to be entertained. The warm-up comedian had done his job well. The crowd was energized, ready to laugh, ready to cheer, ready for whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Kesha stepped into that circle of light, holding her broken guitar, her bare feet, silent on the polished stage floor. She could feel the weight of those 500 gazes on her, could sense the judgment, the assumptions, the expectations of failure that preceded her like a cloud. In the front row, she could see people discreetly raising their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be a train wreck, a moment of schadenfreude to share on social media, to laugh about with friends, to use as evidence that they were better, smarter, more deserving than this dirty child with a broken instrument. Backstage, Richard whispered to his sound technician, a young man named Derek who'd been uncomfortable with this plan from the beginning but didn't have the courage to refuse. "Remember," Richard said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "when she starts singing, activate the faulty sound system. I want that horrible feedback noise coming through the speakers. Make it impossible for anyone to hear anything clearly. It'll be hilarious." Derek nodded reluctantly, his finger hovering over the control that would sabotage the sound. Ashley and the other contestants watched from the wings, some of them genuinely curious, others already smirking in anticipation of the entertainment value of watching someone fail. And James Mitchell stood in the control booth, making eye contact with his personal camera operators, making absolutely certain that every second of what was about to happen would be captured from multiple angles. Kesha stepped up to the microphone. The studio fell into a hush, that particular kind of silence that comes when people are waiting for something they think will be funny. "Hello," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the auditorium in a way that made several people sit up straighter. There was something in that voice, something that didn't match the image of the dirty street kid they'd expected. "My name is Kesha Dorothy Williams. I'm 9 years old, and I want to dedicate this song to my grandmother, who taught me that music has no color or social class." Richard frowned when he heard the full name, Dorothy Williams. Why did that sound familiar? He'd heard that name somewhere before, in some context he couldn't quite remember, but he quickly dismissed the thought, too focused on the prank he was about to pull. Kesha adjusted her guitar, her fingers finding their positions on the strings, with a precision that made several professional musicians in the audience lean forward with interest. Even with broken strings, even with an instrument that was barely functional, she held it like it was an extension of herself. She played the first chords. The sound that came from that damaged guitar was pure, clean, perfectly in tune despite the broken strings, despite the cracks in the wood, despite everything that should have made it sound terrible. Her finger positioning was so precise, her pressure so exact, that she was compensating for every imperfection in the instrument through pure technique. Several people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. That wasn't what they'd expected. And then Richard gave the signal. Derek, feeling sick to his stomach but following orders, activated the sound sabotage. A deafening feedback screech erupted from the speakers, drowning out everything else. The horrible noise that makes everyone cover their ears and wince in pain. The sound system howled and hissed, producing a cacophony that made it impossible to hear anything else. The audience groaned, some people covering their ears, others starting to laugh. They assumed it was the girl's fault somehow, that this street kid had broken something, had messed up the professional equipment with her amateur attempts at music. Technical problems. Richard shouted from the side of the stage, his voice full of false concern. "What a shame, but we'll have to end it here." He was grinning. This was going perfectly, better than he'd planned. The girl would be humiliated, the audience would have their moment of superiority, and the ratings would be fantastic. But Kesha didn't stop. She stepped away from the microphone, walked to the center of the stage, and in a motion that showed no hesitation, no fear, no doubt, she began to sing without amplification. Her voice cut through the feedback like a blade through silk. It rose above the electronic screeching, above the laughter and confusion, above every obstacle they'd put in her path. The voice that emerged from this 9-year-old girl wasn't just loud, it was powerful, trained, perfect. The kind of voice that could fill subway stations and urban tunnels and vast open spaces using nothing but technique and breath control and years of rigorous practice. The static continued. The speakers kept howling. But Kesha's voice was so powerful, so precisely controlled, that it echoed throughout the auditorium, reaching even the people in the back rows. One by one, the laughter died. One by one, people uncovered their ears to listen. One by one, the faces that had been prepared to mock shifted into expressions of shock, then awe, then something approaching reverence. She sang Amazing Grace, but this wasn't the simple version everyone knew. This was the song transformed by years of Dorothy Williams training, blending traditional gospel techniques with classical vocal methods that only someone trained by a master would recognize. Her vibrato was controlled and purposeful. Her breath support was perfect. Every note landed exactly where it should. With exactly the right amount of power and emotion, the audience began to fall completely silent, mesmerized. Even with the sound system still producing that horrible feedback, Kesha's voice soared above it. Clear, pure, impossible to ignore. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Each word carried the weight of everything she'd experienced. Every cold night on the streets, every hungry day, every moment of being dismissed, overlooked, treated like she was less than human. But also every evening with Dorothy, learning, practicing, being shaped into something extraordinary. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Tears began to stream down faces in the audience. People who had come expecting to laugh at a street kid's failure found themselves experiencing something they hadn't expected. Genuine, undeniable talent that transcended circumstance, that made everything else irrelevant. Richard, backstage, went pale. He shouted to Derek, "Turn everything off. Cut the broadcast. Stop recording." But it was too late. James Mitchell had already instructed his team to keep the cameras rolling, to broadcast everything live to millions of American homes. Every moment of Kesha's triumph, every second of her voice rising above the sabotage, every frame of truth overcoming deliberate cruelty. Kesha moved through the verses with perfect control, her voice never wavering, never cracking, never showing strain. She'd trained for this in the harshest conditions imaginable, singing in freezing weather, performing with an empty stomach, maintaining pitch while people shouted and sirens wailed. A faulty sound system was nothing compared to what she'd already overcome. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. The phrase resonated with a truth that made the entire performance something more than just music. This was testimony. This was proof. This was a 9-year-old girl telling the world that they couldn't break her, couldn't silence her, couldn't reduce her to the role they'd tried to force her into. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When she finished, there were 3 long seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence that happens when something has shifted, when people have witnessed something they weren't prepared for, when reality has contradicted all their comfortable assumptions, and then the audience erupted. They rose to their feet, as one. Applause thundering through the auditorium like a physical force. People were shouting, crying, cheering. Strangers embraced each other. Camera operators found their vision blurred by tears they hadn't expected. Even Ashley and the other children backstage were speechless. All their expensive training, all their private lessons, all their conservatory credentials seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of what they'd just witnessed. Backstage, Richard Brennan stood frozen, watching his carefully planned humiliation transform into something he'd never anticipated. The street kid he'd brought on to be comic relief had just delivered the most powerful performance in the show's history. And then James Mitchell walked onto that stage. Before we continue with what happens next with James Mitchell revealing the truth about who Kesha really is and what Richard tried to do, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're feeling what this audience felt, if Kesha's story is hitting you the way it hit them, take a second and share your thoughts so far in the comments below. What part of her journey has struck you the hardest? I read every single one. Ladies and gentlemen, James Mitchell said, taking the microphone with a voice that carried both authority and emotion. My name is James Mitchell, executive director of this television network, and I need to tell you who this extraordinary girl really is." The audience, still on their feet, fell silent. Again, Richard, watching from backstage, turned completely pale. He hadn't known the executive director was even in the building. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. Kesha Dorothy Williams. James continued, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, is the granddaughter of Dorothy Williams, one of the greatest gospel singers and songwriters this country has ever produced. A woman who graduated from Juilliard in 1965, when that was almost impossible for a black woman. A woman who was my personal mentor for over 20 years, who taught me that music had no color, no class, no barriers except the ones we allow others to build. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the auditorium. "Dorothy died 3 years ago," James said, his voice breaking. "And I didn't even know she had a granddaughter living on the ground streets of Los Angeles." Meanwhile, the producers of this show brought this child here not to celebrate her extraordinary talent, but to publicly humiliate her. Cameras found Richard, who was now visibly sweating, trying to back away into the shadows. But there was nowhere to hide. The lights found him. The cameras zoomed in. His face was being broadcast to millions of homes across America. It was all filmed, James continued, his voice hardening. Every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every attempt at sabotage, every moment they tried to turn this child into entertainment at the expense of her dignity. He gestured, and suddenly the backstage footage began playing on the large screens throughout the auditorium. Richard's cruel laugh, his words, "You're here to make the audience laugh." Ashley's father explaining that Kesha was there to show the contrast. The production assistant refusing to let Kesha have food. Derek being ordered to sabotage the sound system. The audience watched in stunned silence as the truth unfolded before them. And then that silence transformed into something else. Anger. Righteous, powerful anger. "Richard Brennan," James said, pointing directly at the man who was now trying desperately to escape. "You're fired. Not just from this show, but from this network. And I will personally ensure that every reputable broadcaster in this country knows exactly what kind of person you are." The audience began to boo. Not the playful booing of a game show, but the deep, visceral sound of collective outrage. Richard tried to shout something in his defense, but his voice was completely drowned out. Security guards were already moving toward him, ready to escort him from the building. "As for you," James turned to Ashley and the other children watching from backstage, his voice softer now but still firm. "I hope you've learned a valuable lesson about judging people by their appearance, about the difference between privilege and talent, about the cost of cruelty disguised as entertainment." Ashley, her face red, with shame, lowered her head. Several other children had started crying, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd participated in. Their parents stood beside them, looking equally mortified as they realized their children's behavior had been broadcast to the entire nation. James, then, knelt beside Kesha, who had remained calm throughout everything, standing in the center of that enormous stage like she belonged there. "Kesha," he said gently, "on behalf of this company, on behalf of everyone who failed you, I apologize. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, not just for your talent, but for the dignity with which you faced all of this." Kesha looked at him with those eyes that seemed far older than 9 years. "She always told me that music is our secret weapon," she replied, her voice clear and strong, "and that the best remedy for prejudice is excellence that cannot be denied." The phrase echoed through the auditorium, captured by every camera, broadcast to millions of viewers. At that moment, something shifted in American culture. This wasn't just a story about one girl anymore. It was about every child who'd been underestimated, every talent that had been dismissed, every person who'd been judged by their circumstances rather than their potential. Richard was escorted out of the building by security guards while the audience continued to applaud Kesha. His 20-year career in television ended in a matter of minutes, destroyed, not by competition or market forces, but by his own arrogance and cruelty. The video footage of his behavior would follow him for the rest of his life, ensuring that no reputable company would ever hire him again. As the show's credits prepared to roll, James embraced Kesha on that stage, and cameras captured a moment that would become iconic. A powerful entertainment executive and a 9-year-old street performer, connected by the legacy of a woman who had taught them both that true excellence transcends every barrier society tries to build. The message was clear, undeniable, and would reverberate across the country for years to come. Underestimating someone based on their appearance or circumstances is always a costly mistake. True talent doesn't choose the cradle it's born into. It simply waits for the right opportunity to shine and rewrite all the rules of a world that insists on putting extraordinary people in boxes too small to contain their greatness. The days following the broadcast became a cultural phenomenon that nobody could have predicted. The video of Kesha singing Amazing Grace while overcoming deliberate sabotage went viral within hours. By the next morning, it had 50 million views. By the end of the week, it had become the most shared television moment of the year. James Mitchell, true to his word, took action that went far beyond simply firing Richard Brennan. The next morning, he called a national press conference. Dozens of news outlets crowded into the network's main conference room, cameras pointing at the screens where James showed all the behind-the-scenes footage in its entirety. This television network failed an exceptional child, James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. We allowed a culture where cruelty could masquerade as entertainment, where a 9-year-old orphan could be brought onto our stage not to be celebrated, but to be humiliated for ratings. That ends now. He announced immediate and sweeping changes. Every show produced by the network would now have child psychologists and social workers on staff. There would be a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or humiliation, and most significantly, he was creating the Dorothy Williams program, a foundation dedicated to identifying and nurturing talented children from underprivileged communities. The public reaction was overwhelming and swift. Richard Brennan's career didn't just end, it imploded. Within 24 hours, his social media accounts were flooded with over 2 million messages. Most were condemnations, but some were far worse, people digging up every questionable decision he'd made in his 20-year career, every moment of casual cruelty, every instance where he'd put ratings above human dignity. He tried to defend himself, gave interviews where he claimed he'd been misunderstood, that it was all taken out of context, that he'd actually been trying to help Kesha by giving her exposure. But each attempt only made things worse. The footage was too clear. His words were too explicit. There was no context that could excuse what he'd done. Within a month, Richard had left Los Angeles entirely. He moved to a small town in Montana where nobody knew who he was, where he could start over without the weight of national disgrace following him. He ended up working as a used car salesman, discovering the hard way that a destroyed reputation is one of the hardest things to rebuild. Ashley and the other participating children faced their own reckoning, though one appropriate for their age and capacity for growth. Ashley's parents, horrified by seeing their daughter's cruelty broadcast nationally, made immediate changes. They withdrew her from the Manhattan Conservatory not as punishment, but because they realized they'd been raising her in a bubble that had made her incapable of empathy. They enrolled her in a regular public school in their neighborhood. Ashley, who had never attended school with children who didn't come from wealth and privilege, found herself suddenly surrounded by classmates from every background imaginable. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and the most important. We want our daughter to learn the value of humility, Ashley's father said in a later interview, his voice heavy with regret. We realize now that we gave her every advantage except the most important one, understanding that people's worth isn't determined by their circumstances. 6 months later, Ashley would write Kesha a letter, a genuine, heartfelt apology that acknowledged not just what she'd done, but why it was wrong. Kesha would respond, and the two would eventually become unlikely friends, proof that even the deepest wounds can become bridges when there's sincerity on both sides. But the most extraordinary changes happened to Kesha herself. James Mitchell didn't just apologize. He transformed the entire situation into an opportunity for real, lasting change. Within a week of the broadcast, he'd arranged for Kesha to have a safe place to live. James and his wife Margaret, who had never been able to have children of their own, asked if they could become her guardians. Then, as they got to know her better, they asked if they could adopt her. Dorothy always said that music connects us as a family, James explained on the day of the official adoption. Kesha isn't just a talented child we're helping. She has brought back something we lost when Dorothy left us. She's brought back purpose. She's brought back the reminder that our gifts aren't just for ourselves, they're for lifting up others who will come after us. Kesha received a full scholarship to the prestigious Los Angeles Music Academy, where she studied under some of the best instructors in the country. But she never forgot where she came from. She kept that broken guitar, now restored and tuned but still bearing the marks of its time, on the streets. As a reminder of her journey, the Dorothy Williams program, funded by the network and by donations that poured in from across the country, began changing lives immediately. Within 6 months, over 200 children from underprivileged communities had received full music scholarships. The program didn't just teach music, it provided housing assistance, food security, counseling, and comprehensive support to ensure that talent wouldn't be wasted due to circumstance. 6 months after the broadcast, Kesha performed at Carnegie Hall as a guest soloist with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. She was 10 years old. The concert was broadcast live across the nation. Over 5 million people tuned in to watch this child who had sung on the streets for coins now performing on one of the most prestigious stages in the world. The performance raised over $5 million for the Dorothy Williams program. During that Carnegie Hall performance, Kesha wore a simple but elegant dress that Margaret had helped her choose, and she carried that same restored guitar, the one she'd found in the trash 3 weeks before her appearance on Stars of America. Before she sang, she spoke to the audience. Her words were measured, thoughtful, carrying wisdom that seemed impossible from someone so young. "I dedicate this music to the memory of my grandmother, Dorothy Williams," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I also dedicate it to all the children who are judged by the color of their skin, their economic background, or the clothes they wear before anyone bothers to discover the talent they carry within themselves." She paused, looking out at the audience of over 2,000 people, at the cameras broadcasting her words across the country. 3 years ago, I was sleeping on the streets of Los Angeles, just a few miles from this theater. Tonight, I'm standing on this stage receiving your applause. What changed wasn't me, it was the opportunity. The real tragedy isn't that children like me exist. It's that so many never get the chance to show what they're capable of. The audience wept openly. Some people stood, unable to contain their emotion. This wasn't just a performance anymore, it was a moment of national reckoning with how society treated its most vulnerable members. Stars of America was completely revamped. James implemented the protocols he'd promised: child psychologists, social workers, strict anti-discrimination policies. The show's new slogan, displayed in gold letters on the stage where Kesha had been humiliated and then triumphed, read, "Talent does not choose its birthplace, color, or social class." The show became something different. Instead of looking for polished performances from children of privilege, it actively sought out undiscovered talent from all backgrounds. It became a platform for giving opportunities rather than entertaining through cruelty. 2 years after the original broadcast, when Kesha was 11 years old, she released her first album, Voices from the Street. It featured classic songs, hymns, gospel standards, art songs, all reimagined with the techniques Dorothy had taught her. The album was a fusion of traditional gospel influences and classical vocal methods, creating something entirely unique. The album debuted at #1 on the classical music charts. It earned her a Grammy nomination for Best Classical Vocal Album. At 11 years old, Kesha Williams was being discussed in the same breath as legendary performers. At the Grammy ceremony, Kesha wore a simple but elegant dress, and she carried that guitar, the one that had started everything, the broken instrument she'd found in the trash, now restored but still bearing its scars. When she accepted the award, she held that guitar up for the cameras. "This guitar taught me that our true strength doesn't come from what we have," she said, her voice steady, "but from what we do with what we have. Sometimes we need to be at our lowest point to discover how high we can fly." The Grammy audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted for over 3 minutes. Ashley watched from her home, tears streaming down her face. The next day, she sent Kesha that handwritten letter, pages of sincere apology, of gratitude for the lesson she'd learned, of acknowledgement about how much the experience had changed her perspective on privilege and humanity. "You taught me that true talent has nothing to do with the opportunities we're born with," Ashley wrote, "but with the courage to keep singing, even when they try to silence us." Kesha responded, and their exchange of letters eventually led to an unlikely friendship. They met for coffee a few months later. Two girls who had been on opposite sides of a moment that had changed both their lives. Ashley was different now, humbler, more aware, genuinely working to understand perspectives she'd never considered before. "Thank you," Ashley said during that first meeting, her voice sincere. "Thank you for showing me who I was becoming. For stopping me before I turned into someone like Richard Brennan." Kesha smiled, not the mysterious smile she'd worn that day backstage, but something warmer. "We all need wake-up calls sometimes," she said. "The important thing is what we do after we wake up." James Mitchell often reflected on how one moment of injustice had become the catalyst for such profound change. In interviews, he frequently spoke about Dorothy Williams and the lessons she'd taught him decades ago, lessons that her granddaughter had embodied perfectly. Dorothy always said that, 2000. "God uses unexpected people to teach the lessons the world needs to learn," he told a journalist from the New York Times. Kesha wasn't just a child we found. She was the teacher we needed. She taught an entire nation that our assumptions about people based on their circumstances are not just wrong, they're dangerous. They make us complicit in wasting human potential. The Dorothy Williams program expanded beyond anyone's expectations. Within 2 years, it had chapters in 15 major cities across the United States. Over 1,000 children had received comprehensive support, not just music education, but housing assistance, food security, counseling, and holistic development. But the program's real innovation was in how it identified talent. Instead of waiting for applications or auditions, teams of trained professionals went into underserved communities. They visited homeless shelters, community centers, public schools in low-income areas. They listened to kids singing on street corners, playing instruments in subway stations, demonstrating raw talent that would have been lost without intervention. Each child they found received the same message: you are not defined by your circumstances. You are defined by what you choose to do with your gifts. Kesha became the artistic director of the program at age 12, working alongside professional educators to shape its direction. She understood something the adults sometimes forgot: what it felt like to be on the other side, to be the child everyone had given up on, to carry talent that nobody believed was worth cultivating. She never forgot her origins. Once a month, she visited homeless shelters and underserved communities personally, not to perform, but to listen, to find the next Kesha, to offer the same opportunity that James Mitchell had given her. "My grandmother always told me that our gifts aren't just to elevate ourselves," she'd tell the children she met, many of them in situations identical to what she'd experienced, but to build bridges so that others can rise as well. By age 13, Kesha had become more than a talented performer. She'd become a symbol, a living reminder that society's judgments about people based on appearance, race, or economic status were not just morally wrong, but fundamentally stupid. They caused us to waste the very talent and potential we claimed to value. Her story was taught in schools, discussed in psychology classes as an example of resilience, analyzed in business schools as a case study in how assumptions can blind organizations to value, referenced in sermons and speeches about dignity and human worth. The lesson was simple, but profound. Underestimating someone based on their appearance, origin, or current situation is always a mistake that comes at a high price. Richard Brennan learned that lesson the hardest way possible. His career destroyed, his reputation in ruins, his name forever associated with cruelty toward a vulnerable child. He tried several times over the years to rehabilitate himself publicly, giving interviews where he claimed to have learned from his mistakes, but each attempt only reignited the public's outrage. The video footage was too clear, the cruelty too explicit. Some mistakes, it turned out, were too profound to recover from. He eventually stopped trying, accepted his fate, lived quietly in that small Montana town, selling used cars, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Sometimes late at night, he'd watch videos of Kesha performing at Carnegie Hall, or accepting her Grammy, or speaking at graduation ceremonies. And he'd think about that moment backstage when he'd laughed at a 9-year-old girl asking if she could have a meal if she sang well. He'd replayed that moment 1,000 times, wondering if he could have chosen differently. But the truth was, his choice that day hadn't been an aberration, it had been a revelation. It had shown who he really was when he had power over someone vulnerable. And that person, it turned out, was someone the world had correctly decided wasn't worth keeping in a position of influence. The show that had nearly destroyed Kesha instead became her platform. Stars of America, under James Mitchell's reformed leadership, became one of the most respected talent programs in the country. It didn't just showcase polish and privilege anymore, it actively sought out raw talent from places others ignored. It gave opportunities instead of exploiting vulnerabilities. And every year, on the anniversary of Kesha's performance, the show dedicated an episode to the Dorothy Williams program, highlighting new talented children who were getting opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Kesha's Grammy win opened doors to opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. She performed at the Kennedy Center. She sang at the White House. She was invited to speak at conferences about child welfare, education reform, and arts accessibility. But she never let the success change who she fundamentally was. She remembered sleeping under that blue plastic awning, remembered the hunger, remembered what it felt like to be looked through rather than looked at, and she used those memories not to fuel bitterness, but to drive purpose. By 14, she'd started writing her own music compositions that blended the gospel traditions her grandmother had taught her with classical structures and contemporary themes. Her second album, Grace and Grit, explored themes of survival, resilience, and redemption through music that critics called hauntingly beautiful and impossibly mature. The album's lead single, Broken Strings, was about that guitar she'd found in the trash, about how broken things can still make beautiful music if someone cares enough to play them with skill and love. The song became an anthem for anyone who'd ever felt discarded, overlooked, or underestimated. Ashley, meanwhile, had found her own path. No longer the entitled child who'd mocked a street kid backstage, she'd grown into a thoughtful young woman who understood privilege not as something to flaunt but as something to use responsibly. She volunteered with the Dorothy Williams program, helping other privileged kids understand that their advantages came with responsibilities. Meeting Kesha changed my life, Ashley said in an interview years later. Not because she humiliated me, she didn't. She could have, but she didn't. She changed my life because she showed me what real strength looks like, what real talent looks like, what real grace looks like, and it looks nothing like what I'd been taught to value. James Mitchell, in his 70s now, often said that discovering Kesha was the most important moment of his career. More important than building a television empire, more important than any business success, more important than any award or recognition. Dorothy taught me decades ago that music connects us, he said. But Kesha taught me something deeper. She taught me that our greatest obligation isn't to the talented people who already have opportunities. It's to the ones who don't. Because talent doesn't ask permission to exist. It just waits, sometimes in the most unexpected places, for someone to give it a chance to shine. The story of Kesha Williams became more than just a feel-good narrative about individual triumph. It became a catalyst for examining how American society treated its most vulnerable members, particularly children. Congressional hearings were held about protections for minors in entertainment, laws were passed, industry standards were raised, all because a 9-year-old girl with a broken guitar had refused to accept the role a television producer had tried to force her into, all because she'd carried her grandmother's lessons in her heart and her voice. All because she'd understood that the best response to prejudice wasn't anger or violence or bitterness, it was excellence that couldn't be denied. Today, Kesha Williams continues to divide her time between her own musical career and the work of the Dorothy Williams program. She's released 5 albums, each one critically acclaimed, each one expanding the boundaries of what classical gospel fusion can be. She's performed in every major concert hall in America and most of the major venues worldwide. But ask her what she's most proud of, and she won't talk about the performances or the awards or the recognition. She'll talk about the kids, the over 5,000 children who've now received opportunities through the Dorothy Williams program, the ones who were singing in subway stations and street corners and homeless shelters, whose talent would have been wasted without intervention, the ones who are now studying at conservatories and music schools, who are performing, who are teaching, who are building lives that would have been impossible without someone seeing past their circumstances to their potential. That's my grandmother's real legacy, Kesha says. Not the awards or the performances. The lives that were changed. The potential that was unlocked. The bridges that were built. She still carries that guitar. The one from the trash. The one Richard Brennan had laughed at. Now restored, professionally maintained, but still bearing its scars. She plays it at every major performance, a reminder to herself and to everyone watching that our past struggles don't diminish us, they shape us into who we're meant to become. The lesson her story teaches resonates across generations now. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, academic studies, and countless discussions, but at its heart, it's remarkably simple. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, their circumstances, or their current situation. Because true talent, true human worth, doesn't ask permission to exist. It simply waits for the opportunity to prove that every assumption you made was wrong. Richard Brennan discovered this truth too late, when his 20-year career collapsed in minutes because he'd treated a vulnerable child as entertainment rather than as a human being deserving dignity. Ashley discovered it just in time, when witnessing Kesha's performance shattered her comfortable assumptions about privilege and worth before they could calcify into the kind of permanent cruelty that destroys lives. James Mitchell discovered it decades earlier from Dorothy Williams, and then rediscovered it through her granddaughter, learning that the most important thing he could do with his success wasn't to accumulate more. It was to build bridges for others, and Kesha herself learned it through survival, through struggle, through sleeping on streets and singing for coins, through carrying her grandmother's lessons like a torch through the darkest nights until finally, she got the chance to show the world what she'd known all along, that she was extraordinary, that her talent was real, that their judgment said everything about them and nothing about her, standing on stages now, performing for thousands, carrying her grandmother's name and legacy forward. Kesha often thinks about that moment backstage. That question she asked Richard Brennan. If I sing well, will you give me a meal? She'd known even then what he couldn't see, that she wasn't asking for charity. She was offering a deal. Her excellence in exchange for basic human dignity. And when he'd laughed, when he'd reduced her to comic relief, he'd revealed more about himself than he'd ever understood. Because Kesha had been ready to show what years of training and genuine talent could do, ready to prove that poverty doesn't erase ability, that circumstances don't determine worth, that you can be barefoot and brilliant, homeless and exceptional, discarded by society and still carry greatness within you. As we close Kesha's story, I want to hear from you. What moment in this journey affected you the most? Was it Kesha's grandmother teaching her that music is a secret weapon? Was it that moment when she stepped away from the microphone and sang through the Sabotage? Was it Richard's career collapsing under the weight of his own cruelty? Was it Ashley learning humility? Tell me what hit you hardest, and why stories like Kesha's matter. Share your thoughts in the comments. The truth is, Kesha Williams' story matters, because it's not unique. There are countless children with extraordinary gifts who never get the chance to develop them. Countless talents wasted because we judge by appearance rather than potential. Countless Keshas sleeping on streets and singing in subway stations, waiting for someone to see past their circumstances to the greatness they carry. The Dorothy Williams program exists to find them, to give them what Kesha got a chance. Not charity, not pity, just the opportunity to show what they're capable of when someone believes in them enough to invest in their potential. And every child the program helps is a refutation of the assumptions society makes. Every success story is proof that we're terrible at predicting human potential based on external factors. Every life changed is evidence that the best investment we can make as a society is in nurturing talent wherever we find it, regardless of the circumstances in which it currently exists. Richard Brennan tried to diminish Kesha Williams to make himself feel bigger. He discovered that trying to diminish someone else's light doesn't make yours brighter. It just reveals how small your light really was to begin with. True victory, Kesha learned, isn't in defeating your enemies. It's in becoming so extraordinary that they become irrelevant. It's in using the platform their cruelty inadvertently gave you to change systems, to open doors, to build bridges for everyone coming after you. It's in taking your grandmother's lessons about grace and dignity and resistance, carrying them through the hardest circumstances imaginable, and then using them not for revenge but for transformation. It's in holding a broken guitar and making music so beautiful that no one can deny it. It's in singing through Sabotage until your voice is the only thing anyone can hear. It's in proving, day after day, performance after performance, life after life changed, that true talent doesn't choose its birthplace, its color, or its social class. It simply is, and it simply waits. And when it finally gets its chance to shine, it rewrites all the rules of a world that insisted on putting extraordinary people in boxes too small to contain their greatness. Thank you for watching Kesha's journey unfold. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions, if it reminded you that human potential can exist anywhere, I invite you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button. Let me know this story resonated with you. Second, subscribe to True Justice. We tell stories like Kesha's stories about people who overcame impossible odds, who proved that circumstances don't determine destiny, who showed us that our assumptions about others often reveal more about us than about them. And third, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you took away from Kesha's story. Tell me if it changed how you think about talent, about potential, about the people society overlooks. Tell me if you've ever been underestimated, or if you've ever underestimated someone else. This conversation matters, and I want to hear your voice in it. Stories like Kesha's remind us that true victory isn't in defeating our enemies. It's in becoming so extraordinary that they become irrelevant. That the best response to prejudice is excellence that cannot be denied. That a 9-year-old girl with a broken guitar and her grandmother's lessons can change the world if we just give her the chance. Thank you for being part of this journey. I'll see you in the next story.